Welcome, dear viewers, to a heartwarming tale of second chances, unexpected heroism, and the transformative power of love in the high-stakes world of fine dining. Enjoy the story. The crisp winter air nipped at George Harley's cheeks as he paced back and forth in the nearly deserted city park. At 47, he cut an impressive figure, salt and pepper hair artfully tousled, a tailored wool coat hugging his still athletic frame. To any passerby, he looked every inch the successful businessman he was. But right now, none of that mattered. His 5-year-old grandson, Paul, had vanished. "Yes, Jenny, I've got him," George lied into his phone, trying to keep the panic from his voice as he spoke to his daughter. "We're having a great time. I'll have him back by dinner. Don't worry." He ended the call and frantically scanned the park. "Paul!" he called out, his voice echoing in the empty space. "Paul! Where are you? This isn't funny anymore." George's mind raced. How could he have been so careless? One moment, Paul was gleefully chasing pigeons, and the next, he was gone. He cursed himself for getting distracted by that damn phone call as he jogged toward the playground. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air, and George's heart stopped. He knew that voice. "Paul!" he yelled, breaking into a sprint toward the sound. It was coming from the direction of the river. George's feet pounded against the frozen ground as he raced toward the riverbank, his breath coming in ragged gasps, forming small clouds in the frigid air. As he crested the small hill overlooking the water, his worst fears were realized. There, in the middle of a partially frozen section of the river, was Paul. The boy's small arms flailed wildly as he struggled to keep his head above the icy water. "Oh God, Paul!" George cried out, his mind blank with terror. He knew he'd never reach the boy in time. Suddenly, a blur of motion caught his eye. A woman bundled in a threadbare coat was dashing across the ice. She moved with surprising agility, her feet barely touching the slippery surface as she made her way toward Paul. George watched in awe and terror as the stranger reached his grandson. With strength that belied her slight frame, she plunged her arms into the frigid water and hauled Paul out. The ice creaked ominously beneath them as she began to inch her way back to shore, cradling the soaking wet child against her chest. By the time George reached the water's edge, the woman had almost made it. He waited, heedless of the bone-chilling cold, and helped them onto solid ground. "Paul, oh thank God," George sobbed, gathering the shivering boy into his arms. He turned to the woman, who was now trembling violently, her clothes soaked through. You saved him. I can't thank you enough." The woman attempted a smile, her teeth chattering too much to speak. George made a split-second decision. "Come with us quickly. We need to get you both warm." Without waiting for a response, he scooped up Paul and gestured for the woman to follow. They hurried toward his parked Mercedes, leaving wet footprints in their wake. The opulent foyer of George's mansion was soon awash with frantic activity. Olivia, the ever-efficient housekeeper, whisked Paul away to a hot bath, leaving George alone with the mystery woman who had saved his grandson's life. "The bathroom's just down the hall," George said, gesturing. "There are plenty of towels, and I'll have Olivia bring you some dry clothes." The woman nodded gratefully and disappeared into the bathroom. George paced nervously, his mind reeling from the day's events. Who was this woman? Where had she come from? And how could he ever repay her for what she'd done? 15 minutes later, they were seated in the plush living room, steaming mugs of tea warming their hands. The woman, now dressed in borrowed clothes that hung loosely on her thin frame, looked around the room with barely concealed awe. "I'm George," he said, breaking the silence. "And you are?" "Helen," she replied softly. "Helen Reeves." "Helen, I can't thank you enough for what you did. If there's anything I can do to repay you—" Helen's eyes dropped to her lap. "Actually," she said hesitantly, "I've been looking for work. I don't suppose you know of any openings, anything at all?" George leaned forward, intrigued. "What kind of work are you looking for?" Helen's laugh was tinged with bitterness. "At this point, anything. No one seems to want to hire an ex-con." The words hung in the air between them. George's eyebrows shot up in surprise, but to his credit, his expression quickly softened into one of compassion. "Ex-con?" he probed. Helen nodded, her shoulders slumping. "I got out 2 months ago. First and only offense, I swear. But it doesn't matter. One look at my record and every door slams shut. George leaned back, considering. He thought of Paul, safe and warm upstairs, all thanks to this woman. Ex-con or not, she'd risked her life without hesitation. That had to count for something. Well, he said slowly, as it happens, I do know of an opening. How do you feel about the hustle and bustle of the kitchen at Hartley's? The hustle and bustle of the kitchen at George's upscale restaurant was a far cry from the sterile quiet of Helen's recent past. She moved through the organized chaos with a sense of purpose, her eyes bright and alert as she absorbed every detail of her new environment. George watched her from the doorway, a small smile playing on his lips. He'd taken a chance on Helen, starting her as a kitchen assistant, and so far she was exceeding all expectations. She approached each task, no matter how menial, with a focus and determination that impressed even his veteran staff. As the weeks passed, George found himself spending more and more time in the kitchen, ostensibly to oversee operations, but in reality to observe Helen. There was something about her, a hidden depth, a flicker of expertise that seemed at odds with her position as a novice kitchen hand. His suspicions were confirmed one hectic Friday evening. The restaurant was packed, reservations spilling over into the bar area. In the midst of the dinner rush, George noticed Helen confidently step up to one of the cooking stations, effortlessly taking over for an overwhelmed line cook. Her movements were fluid, precise. She handled the pans with the ease of a seasoned chef, expertly plating dishes that looked like works of art. George's jaw dropped. Who is this woman? As the night wound down and the last customers trickled out, George approached Helen, who was wiping down her station. That was quite a performance, he said, causing her to start slightly. Where did you learn to cook like that? Helen's cheeks flushed as she avoided his gaze. Oh, picked up a few things here and there. George raised an eyebrow. A few things? Helen, what I saw tonight was years of professional experience. Why didn't you tell me you were a trained chef? Helen's shoulders slumped, and when she finally met his eyes, the pain he saw there made his heart ache. Because, she said softly, that part of my life is over. Or at least, I thought it was. George's office was uncharacteristically chaotic. Papers were strewn across his usually immaculate desk, and he paced back and forth, phone pressed to his ear. Yes, Senator, I understand the importance, of course. We'd be honored this Friday. Yes, we'll make it work. He ended the call and slumped into his chair, running a hand through his hair. A soft knock at the door made him look up. Come in, he called out, straightening up. Arthur, his head chef and old friend, limped in, his leg encased in a bulky cast. Hey, George, you look like you've seen a ghost. What's up? George groaned. Senator Williams is coming for dinner on Friday with a delegation of foreign diplomats. Arthur whistled low. Big fish, but we can handle it, right? I mean, I'm laid up, but that's just it, George interrupted. The senator has requested a special menu. Fusion cuisine with elements from each diplomat's home country. It's not our usual fare, Art. I'm not sure we can pull it off. Arthur's face fell. Damn, that is a pickle. Have you told the staff yet? George shook his head. I'm about to. I don't know what we're going to do. Moments later, the kitchen staff was gathered, faces a mix of excitement and apprehension as George explained the situation. So, he concluded, I'm open to any ideas. How do we make this work? A heavy silence fell over the group. Then a quiet voice spoke up from the back. I might be able to help. All heads turned to see Helen, looking nervous but determined. You're one of the line cooks, scoffed a staff member. No offense, but you're just a kitchen assistant. George held up a hand to silence the murmurs. Go on, Helen. What do you have in mind? I know fusion cuisine. I can help you create a menu. I have a few ideas that might work. After a moment of stunned silence, George nodded slowly. All right, let's hear it. Helen took a deep breath and began sharing her ideas, her passion igniting as she spoke. Within minutes, the tension in the room melted away. That's brilliant, Arthur exclaimed. We can work with that. As the planning continued, George watched Helen, admiration swelling in his chest. It was incredible to witness her come alive in her element. By Friday evening, the restaurant was a whirlpool of activity. Helen was in her element, directing the kitchen staff with an expertise that transformed the atmosphere. The tantalizing aromas wafting from the kitchen set the stage for an unforgettable evening. As the guests arrived, the dining room buzzed with anticipation. George greeted each diplomat personally, his heart racing as he wondered how they would receive the unconventional menu. But as plates began to leave the kitchen, the sound of delighted murmurs echoed back to him. Guests were enjoying the food, praising its uniqueness, and George found himself beaming with pride. Helen's creations were a hit. As the evening wound down, Senator Williams approached George with a wide grin. "Your staff has outdone themselves. That was exceptional." George's heart swelled. "Thank you, Senator. I can't take all the credit. I have a brilliant chef on my team." The senator's eyebrows shot up. "Really? Who?" "Her name is Helen," George said, glancing back at the kitchen. "She was a kitchen assistant until tonight." As the senator's eyes brightened with interest, George felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. Helen had been given a second chance, and she was more than rising to the occasion. She was thriving. In the days that followed, Helen became an integral part of the kitchen, her talents recognized and celebrated. George often joined her, sharing laughter and stories as they created new dishes together. But with every success, the shadows of her past crept closer. One afternoon, George caught her staring out the kitchen window, a look of longing etched across her face. "What's on your mind?" he asked gently. Helen sighed, rubbing her arms as though she were cold. I can't help but think about my life before all this, how everything fell apart. I'm terrified it could happen again." George stepped closer, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're not that person anymore. You have a gift, and you're making a difference here. Remember, we all have a past. What matters is who we choose to be now." She looked up at him, eyes shining with unshed tears. "Thank you, George, for believing in me." That night, George returned home to find Paul waiting up for him. "You're back late, Grandpa. Did you have fun at work?" George chuckled, ruffling the boy's hair. "More than I could have imagined, Paul. You know, we met a real-life superhero today. She's a chef, and she saved you." Paul's eyes widened. "Really? Like in the cartoons?" "Absolutely," George said, his heart swelling with pride. "She's going to show the world just how amazing she is." Days turned into weeks, and as Helen's reputation grew, so did her confidence. The restaurant became a local sensation, earning rave reviews and a loyal following. George watched her transform from a timid assistant into a respected chef, her vibrant personality lighting up the kitchen. But amid the success, a deeper bond blossomed between them. Late nights spent experimenting with new recipes turned into laughter-filled conversations, and George found himself drawn to Helen in ways he hadn't anticipated. One evening, as they prepared for another busy night, George hesitated, glancing at Helen as she expertly diced vegetables. "Helen, I need to tell you something." She looked up, curiosity dancing in her eyes. "What is it?" "I've come to care for you more than I expected. You brought something back into my life I didn't know I was missing." Her cheeks flushed, and she looked away, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. "I feel the same way, George." Before he could respond, the door swung open, and Arthur stepped in, breathless. "George, we've got a problem in the dining room." The moment shattered, but George couldn't shake the warmth that bloomed in his chest. As the restaurant thrived, George and Helen's relationship deepened. They learned to navigate each other's paths, forging a connection built on understanding, resilience, and shared dreams. Months later, the day arrived for George to reveal a new venture, a restaurant of their own, one where they could create freely without the constraints of the past. He watched as Helen entered the empty space, her eyes wide with wonder. "This is incredible," she exclaimed. "It's ours, Helen, you and me. I want us to build something together, to create a haven for others who've been lost." Tears glistened in her eyes as she stepped forward, embracing him tightly. "I never imagined I could have this. Thank you for believing in me." As they stood in that empty restaurant, both knew their journey was just beginning. Together, they would transform not just the space, but lives, one plate at a time, offering second chances to those who needed it most. The end. Thank you for joining us in this heartwarming journey of love, redemption, and the magic of second chances.